Hello, and welcome to the Armin Show podcast, where we are learning more always. Science, people, creativity. Subscribe if you haven't. YouTube, Spotify, all the places. The show is booming online and also in person. Variety, sometimes panels. We bring all kinds of variety. Learning is key, and I like books, nonfiction, and all those things. On this episode here, we have someone who speaks in the category of something that's always been important to me, the future, if you will, along with other topics. We have our guest today, Bronwyn Williams, coming from South Africa. Welcome to the show.
Hello. So thank you for inviting me.
I'm very glad to have you on. Say that again?
What do you want to know?
I want to know everything, Bronwyn. Quite a few things.
Everything.
Just all the answers. If we could get all the answers in there. And
42. There you go. We can end the call right now.
The other day I got the number 42 for like a Q number that I got for something. I thought, wait a minute, am I the answer to all of this? Possibly. Could be the case. That's funny.
It could be the case.
We need all the answers. By the end of this episode, everybody will have understood all the things that are relevant about existence and can move forward.
Yeah, we'll solve all the world's problems. There's absolutely no pressure. And yeah, I'm very confident we can attack that task with panache.
Golden title. We solved all the world's problems. Check that. Boom. Nice. Now, I would like to give some background here. You're a futurist, economist, and business trends analyst. You're from Johannesburg, South Africa. And, well, how did you get into this category of interest? Because you're not the opposite of this would be like a historical person, I guess, and a person looking at things of the past. You look more towards trends and the future. Why this category, and how does that connect with your personality?
Well, I have to say, first of all, that trends are backwards looking to start with, right? So a trend is a pattern, takes place like following some sort of pattern, whether it's cyclical or whether it's linear or whatever it is. So we are quite backwards looking because it's all we've got to really go on when it comes to trying to make a way into the future. But it's probably a good point to make a distinction between my very checkered academic and career path. The very, very clear distinction between like economics and futures. So with economics, we tend to do a lot of forecasting. That's what politicians base their assumptions on. That's what central bankers make predictions and projections on as to what they're going to do with interest rates and inflation. And that's the forecasts, ironically, are very backwards looking. We look at trends, we look at data that has happened in the past, and then we extrapolate a likely course of action. So a forecast is about sort of zeroing in on the most likely course of action that's going to take place. So yeah, so it's sort of a narrowing of the triangle, right? Whereas futures and future studies, which is a real academic discipline, yes, mom and dad, it's a real job. Okay, it's all about the opposite. It's a real job. We get paid and everything. So that's how you know it's a real job. It's about foresight, and foresight is the opposite of forecasting in that it's divergent, not convergent. So it's about not what we are projecting to be likely to happen, but rather what could happen in the various different extremes. So it's a much broader playing field. It's much more open-ended, and you have to actually then not look at what's happened in the past, but to rather think about what could be, and more importantly, kind of what should be. Although your role as a futurist is not to be too prescriptive in terms of that what should be, otherwise you start inadvertently to get falling back into the forecasting role. And the other sort of really weird thing about forecasting, which is something they do teach you in economics, like if you get a real degree, and they actually will teach you those sort of subjects, is that expectations do shift reality. So the very act of making a forecast changes people's behavior and makes that forecast more likely to happen. I mean, we see this all the time with interest rates, with inflation, with everything that's going on in the world. Like expectations do shape reality. So the future's role is actually to try and break out of that trap, break out of that forecasting trap, and actually think about alternative futures to get people to take actions that aren't just reinforcing the really quite few sort of views that are put on the table in terms of the forecast that basically dictate our short term and therefore, as things go on, our long-term future as society. So in other words, the more we keep relying on forecasts and believing in them, the more likely they are to happen. So if you kind of don't like the forecasts, you have to sort of break away from that and actually very consciously change your behavior to stop inadvertently, which is often the case, reinforcing the worst case scenarios we see around us, which is a very ironic but also quite revelatory thought when you start to think about the space. So anyway, that's how my two hats fit together. When you put both the triangles together, you're basically a shiny star, right? So
there's a shiny star where they converge.
Yeah.
Like a bright light of sorts.
A North Star, there you go.
Right. The North Star of understanding. Oh, and of those two, convergent and divergent, do you have a preference of which methodology you would want to use, or does neither speak to you more than the other?
Well, I think both of them do. I think that that's why I'm in this sort of this non-career kind of career path, in that I'm constantly like trying to orientate myself in both space and time. I don't always do a very good job of either. I tend to be quite absent-minded and quite sort of divergent in what I look at, and also sort of zooming in and out, which is kind of what you have to do in order to be useful either in a trained analyst point of view, the more sort of convergent thinking, or the more divergent thinking. You have to have quite a broad perspective in both space and time. So you have to have a good historical understanding about how we've got to where we've got, talking about the macro and the micro trends that are centering on the present moment, but also to have some sort of interest into the blank space, right? So it's a sort of career that you need both left and right brain, to use those sort of cliches thinking. You have to be interested in both the small and the big, both the wood and the trees, as we sort of like to say, right? You can't really choose one or the other, which is, I think, why people actually pay me and listen to the things we do. We basically paid to be interesting, to sort of challenge people's thinking. But in order to do that, you have to understand what those trends are, what those forecasts are. You can't challenge something if you can't articulate it, and if you can't talk credibly about how those things were formulated and why they should perhaps be dismantled or repackaged in a slightly different way.
Multiple things come to mind there. One is definitely non-linear thinking in place there, which is my branch of thinking.
Complex systems thinking, like it's all about chaos out there. I think I had that on my website for a while. I don't know if it's still there. Like chaos whisperer was something that someone once called me, and that makes sense, right? So you have to kind of be comfortable with the chaos, be comfortable with uncertainty, but also understand what those sort of base cases are. So we kind of do need a fair degree of credibility, which means we need quite a wide general knowledge and quite a deep understanding of the present moment in time, because that's the sort of jumping off point for anything that's going to happen next.
I have a thought that those who are in the chaos-based space have to, or benefit over time, because at first those individuals, it's like, what? But then over time, okay, there's the building of base, the foundation of understanding, and all the elements of the network link in, whereas linear individuals get a head start earlier in existence, and like, okay, you're following standard operating procedures, but later when it gets to more complexity, the buildup is not as strong because it's just boom, 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 whereas ours is like 15 different things are connecting with each other. There's more, the build is later but larger, in my opinion.
Well, I don't like to say that the one way of thinking about it is right or not. I think this is what economics training will teach you. This is always another hand, right? It's all about finding balance. And there's marginal returns to just about anything, like that bell curve curves and pretty much anything that you're talking about. And the sort of trade-off you're talking about there is one we've seen quite a lot recently. It's one that I've spoken about quite a lot. So this trade-off between efficiency and resilience, right? So like very linear systems-based thinking is all about efficiencies, right? And we saw this with our global supply chains. We see this with the way we run our businesses. We see this with like sort of lean staffing complements, whatever your case might be. It's this efficiency versus resilience. In order to be resilient, you have to let go of some efficiency, because that's about putting slack in the system and building for contingencies. So we see now the consultants and the PwCs of this world and all of them sort of, and the McKinseys and all the big companies sort of getting on the table now and talking about, instead of like just in time, it's just in case planning, and we're like, guys, we've been talking about this for ages, but like you have to have a crisis before people understand that tipping point. And a lot of our society has been maximized towards efficiency. This is like also the trade-off with like globalization, for example. Nothing wrong with trade and with like embracing different cultures and diversity and all the rest of it, but there are trade-offs when it comes to globalization in terms of trade policy. As sort of Renee Girard said, like once the whole world is globalized, you can set fire to the whole thing with a single match, right? So it's like you've always got to find a balance. You don't want to go the other direction and sort of close yourself off to opportunity. And I love that about humanity's journey. Also something I've spoken about quite a lot. It's a very beautiful, very human story, the story of human evolution. Like you might not think that humans are the most perfect creatures on the planet, but you would have to be pretty daft to argue the point that we are the most dominant creatures on the planet, that the planet is literally being shaped according to our will, for better or for worse. We are the most powerful creatures, and we're there because we have a particular evolutionary advantage. And that is, again, finding a balance in the dance between cooperation and conflict. So, you've always got to have that balance there. So you have to cooperate in order to build a building, in order to set that tower up or get that rocket into space. You have to have a degree of coordination and collaboration. But at the same time, if you don't have in-group competition, a bit of sort of grist in that mill, you actually end up, ironically, becoming evolutionarily unfit. You become unsustainable by trying to sustain what you have, which is, I think, a very, very interesting way to think about it. But I always like to think everything's about sort of trade-offs, marginal returns to everything. And then in terms of if you want to see which way the wheel's turning, just follow the incentives, right? So incentives trump anything you're talking about in terms of intentions. And I think that's probably the most useful practical tip you can take away from listening to this. If you want to predict the future, follow the incentive, not the intention, because the incentive is the lever that's going to drive what happens next.
That's a great point. I also like that, by the way, nice is a message. That's a takeaway message for the listeners out there. And
It's solving all your problems. Follow us for more great advice.
They are now expanded in some form, which is a wonderful thing. The element there of trying to hold on to the item, sustain the moment in a way, I've seen that as a point of weakness. If you try to sustain or hold on to the thing as it is in the current moment, you may hold on to it for a little bit. It just dwindles. It's not meant for that. That's not how
There's
reality.
nothing sustainable about sustaining. I mean, like, just pick up a musical instrument. You can only sustain that note for so long. You can't hold it. You have to keep moving in order to keep it alive.
That's a great example, actually. Right, the note will. That's how reality has functioned for a long time.
You want to keep the dance going. If you want to sustain the dance, you can't sustain the note, right? Yeah, it's always that trade-off.
I've once talked about that in human behavior for like when for pleasure. We have hedonic adaptation. So anything, even if it's enjoyable, the same song or whatever, it'll be less enjoyable over time because we're not meant to just find one thing and then we're complete as humans, and that was the last step ever. Yeah.
We enjoy a little bit of pain, right? So that's how things evolve and progress, right?
Right. There's be a counterforce. If there's none of that,
we're a
then
slightly kinky species. That's basically one way to put it, right?
Say again?
Slightly kinky as a species.
Right. Valid point.
We enjoy the pain.
But not publicly. Most public.
Not too much. Always marginal returns, yeah. Too much pain will break you. Too little pain, you'll have no progress, right? So the truth is somewhere between like the Stoics and the complete hedonists, right? Which are two very big schools of thought at the moment. I mean, if you look at sort of like pop culture on the one hand and the literal rise of like the Stoic movement on the other, right? You know, the truth is somewhere in between.
I had a couple of episodes that was just based on Stoicism quotes, and one person who studied the Stoics. So I've talked about the Stoics a few times. Not so much I should get a hedonist, I guess. I'll find a hedonist.
Get David Pearce on. He was on my web show a while back, and he's probably one of the most eloquent advocates of that. He's a philosopher who speaks quite a lot about that. David Pearce, very interesting guy.
There we go. That one is in the record.
Hedonic imperative.
Oh, okay. I think I made on that one. Maybe.
It'd be
a lot of books.
Contrast to the Stoics.
That'll be good, and I'll compare it to the ones that are discussed then.
I mean, I have plenty to disagree with him there too, because I think that utilitarianism is probably one of the biggest fallacies that we've fallen into. Because utilitarianism is anti my philosophy of marginal returns to everything. It's about a maximizing equation, right?
What would be your counter to that?
Yeah, well, I think the main thing with I know that I've got many peers that would disagree with my even interpretation of utilitarianism, but I think that the main criticism is the same criticism that goes towards economics. This idea of us being able to measure utility as a whole, at a group level, right? This idea that we can arbitrage pleasure, pain, suffering, or reward, right? That we can take from one to give to another. And the sort of, like the whole rationalist community is kind of based around that too. And these are very smart people, probably far smarter than me. But you kind of always have to ask the question that the same thing with economics, like what maximizes my utility is not what maximizes yours. And where joy comes from and where actual win-win trades come from is actually by people making those arbitrage equations in a sort of free market sense. Like, because I value something less and you value something more. So it's the whole thing. Exactly. We have to have a free market for sort of ethics too. There's a great hubris in trying to think that we can actually organize utility by setting parameters that maximize things that, at a group level. So I think it's a very personal thing. It really comes down to a sort of philosophical sense that morality and ethics is individual, and that absolutes in terms of anything will drive you into insanity. Like even take like murder, right? Like murder's bad, but like what about self-defense? Or what if it was an accident, or what if it's an ectopic pregnancy? These questions become really this. Ethics is all exceptionalism, right? So in order to try and make a right or rule set, you are failing at the first hurdle. And that's kind of what you have to do. You have to account and assign weights when you start going down that road, whether you're sort of a positivist or a negativist in the sort of utilitarian sense. I just find it quite a dangerous philosophy because it sets us as thinking that we know and that the equation can be solved. And I'm not sure it can. It can only be solved by one person at a time.
Right. Each person. As you mentioned,
I'm not exactly a big government sort of totalitarian social planner. I definitely lean more towards the chaos, anarchy. Let everyone make their own choices, make their own mistakes. Many small mistakes are better than one big one. That's basically my philosophy.
Oh yeah, right. I wrote that too. The channel that I have.
Some of them will balance each other out, right? Surely.
Right. I used to be called Armentropy, the name of my channel, because I combined Arm and entropy. So
nice.
I'm a big fan of.
You can't resist entropy. You can only work with it, right? Just like I believe you can't resist human nature. You can only work with it, which comes back to that thing of like incentives. If you want to see the future, show me the incentive.
Follow that. Yeah, that's kind of like a more advanced version of where they would say, if you want to see what countries are doing, follow the money. This is like if you want to see what humans or where we're going, follow that direction.
Yeah. It scales, like what can I get out of this? Who's gaining, who's losing? And what are the loopholes? Humans are so good at finding loopholes. Like that's my incentive. Like we think we make it, and every time you sort of set an incentive, you create a counter incentive, right? So you have to kind of follow the logic all the way through.
As you're mentioning, the topic is kind of cool because then I have this the little book of big ethical questions, making me think of ethics. You mentioned the free market. Like as you're mentioning, I'm thinking of each book that's right next to me. So it's a variety of topics.
I'll have to take notes. I've been a bit bad with my reading this year. I made a very big mistake. I read Infinite Jest, and it took me like a month, which is longer than it's ever taken me to read a book. And it's like now my brain is a bit confused.
Let's throw that in there. I don't mention fiction too much. That's one of the most popular books on the planet in the other category, and super challenging. And you read through the whole thing. What can one take away from Infinite Jest, one of the most famous fiction books out there?
Well, what I found really interesting about that, and particularly reading it at this point in time, is the move we're seeing at the moment towards hedonism, towards escapism. Because obviously it's a book about addiction, it's a book about sort of, escaping in many various different senses. Obviously there's a lot going on there. But I just find it very, very interesting because we're seeing a lot of sort of escapes at the moment, opting out of uncomfortable reality. And we're seeing like sort of three, I did a talk last year, what was it called? Sex, Drugs, and AI Eurovision, which kind of spoke about the three sort of escapism sort of routes that we're kind of seeing at the moment, all very hedonistic, right? So you've got like a lot of escapism through psychedelic drugs, a lot of stuff going through the metaverse stuff too, and then of course a lot of spiritual sort of awakenings, very spiritual, but various different degrees of it. All of these sort of like looking to make reality more palatable, right? So we're seeing a lot of that at the moment, and that sort of ties into another thing that I was looking at a couple of years ago, the sense of postalgia, which is kind of a sense of kind of being stuck in the present and kind of giving up on the future. So it's sort of the opposite of nostalgia, sort of looking after a past you can't go back to. It's like a sense of longing for a future that you're never going to get to, which is very sort of like stuck, right? And let's be honest, there's nothing quite like a global pandemic, whatever your thoughts on the politics of the policies around how it was handled it's completely irrelevant. The point is there was an awful lot of death in the air, right? It was a very focused on, there's nothing quite like the whole world focused on mortality and lifespans and, livelihoods versus lives, to make you really sort of question like your existence and your place on this planet. The fact that we are sort of naked apes clinging to our third rock from the sun, heading towards certain death, like when you sort of forced to confront that, and the whole kind of world was. We see a lot of people looking for escapism. And then, of course, you had like Mark Andreessen, who, again, whatever you think about him as a person and all the rest of it, has called many things right. He has a handle on those incentives that are driving the future. And like his whole interview on reality privilege shaped a lot of the conversations I've had this year and a lot of the talks that I've given to people, in that it's a very profound concept that makes us question that idea of escapism that we're seeing at the moment. And that whole sort of very that very almost sort of matrix thing of like, let's just sort of unplug and let's not think about it. And the idea that if reality can't get better or hasn't got better, that it's perfectly acceptable to offer people a synthetic alternative to that, right? Which is something philosophers have debated for centuries. Like, is a synthetic life worth the same as a human life? And that takes us very quickly towards like the whole AI conversations and all the rest of it. But, it's kind of hard to argue on the one hand that if someone is sleeping rough on the streets and you can give them a VR headset and they can imagine that they are a prince eating, like 3-course meals or 17-course meals served by waiters, and if they're able to believe that, who are we to deny them that at least imagination of experiencing the things are great, which takes us right back to the sort of the hedonistic imperative in David Pearson, like maximize for happiness, even if it's not real happiness, even if it's happiness without the grist of real life. It makes you really question like the meaning of everything that we're doing. And as usual, I sort of derail these conversations and we end up talking into ourselves into philosophical sort of dead ends before we can even get to
at all.
But I think that's an important concept, because this whole idea of escapism is, again, stopping us as a society from being able to break away from the forecasts that are put on the table, whether they're forecasts of sort of climate apocalypse or forecasts of inflation or forecasts of war and rumors of war, whatever that might be. It's kind of darkened our ability to imagine anything beyond that. And it's also disincentivized us from imagining that. So we've got both the stick and the carrot working against the future and putting us into the present, right? Which I think is a very interesting place to be. And there's very tangible examples of that. Like 100 years ago, the World's Fair, we imagined the flying cars and the Mars colonies and everything. We're only kind of just getting to now. In fact, we haven't even articulated or actualized those old visions, but we haven't come up with any new ones. Not only have we not fulfilled what our sort of great-grandparents dreamt up, we have no new stories since then. Like, we can think of like Elon Musk's and the Jeff Bezos's and be like, oh, look how exciting they are. They're talking Mars colonies and stuff. But those are old ideas. They are very old ideas. They were science fiction from the 1910s and the 1920s. What new stories do we have? We don't have any. Science fiction now is all climate apocalypse related.
This is true.
What's there to look forward to? Like, why bother? Let's all just jump into the metaverse. Or as I said, like in the future, we'll have like timeshare on a VR sex bot, and we'll have like, psychedelic drugs pumped into the water system to keep us all cool and happy, right? And if we're happy, does it matter? But at the same time, if we're just happy, we're in that sustaining but not sustainable pattern, right? That's a sure end in maybe a very sort of pleasant, but basically a narcotic long sleep for society, right?
The opioid continuation.
That's the base case scenario.
Right.
That's the forecast. We don't have to stick with it, though. That's
right.
Nice.
We don't want to be trapped in that form. We see a lot of that where if there's videos that are called like satisfying videos, people like watching those for hours because, oh, that's so satisfying how that was cut exactly smoothly or something.
That's another infinite jest trope, right? Like the whole...
Also, like smooth, like ASMR, same category. Things that are like comfort in the moment are super duper popular at the current time, leading to that state you're describing. And is that the goal?
Yeah,
like,
is it a goal? Sort of... if you're a hedonist, or if you're a hedonist utilitarian, you might say that's a perfectly worthy goal.
Or is that bypassing the whole point of that joyfulness was to propel people to do things,
potential,
and then reach towards the difficulty, and then propelled up. But if you just stay up here, it's like this weird, zombie type state that seems to be, we're progressing in that direction.
Yeah, very happy zombies. We have drugs for that.
The happiest zombies ever. There's no issues.
Well, you'll own nothing, but you will be happy. Yeah, there's plenty of ways to make you happy. Like, we can make everyone happy. The question is, should we?
What do you think about the idea that makes us, or those who do that category, fragile? Because now it's like instead of paying from 1 to 10, Now they got rid of these through all their happy net mechanisms. Now they're up here. Now from 9 to 10, now they made it a new 1 to 10 in that
Well, you're
section
talking
of.
about inequality, right? Sort of if everyone is poor and sick and weak or mentally fragile or unhappy, any sort of progress leads to inequality, which politically speaking, in this sort of like utilitarian happy world, could be justifiably shut down, right? Because it could lead to more unhappiness for those who aren't progressing or improving in some direction, right? This is the great debate in terms of like human nature denialism, right? Like you got to work with it. So it's a tricky question to think about, but I think that at the moment, like what we have in terms of science, technology, biology, and what we know about the human mind and how we literally can build hedonic treadmills. We've built them for mice, right? Where you can plug the mice into a wire and all the mouse wants to do is get its orgasmic hit from like hitting its head on the button to the detriment of all else, of eating, sleeping, sex, nothing is interesting. That's a very happy mice, but it's a very dead mouse, right? Like that could be, depending on your ethics, a perfectly noble goal to progress towards. I'm not here to tell you what your ethics should be. Again, ethics are personal, but they become very scary when they try to be centralized and imposed upon everyone else, right? So I think, again, that comes back to the dynamic tension in humanity. We should have people that are disagreeing with this, right? That's another thing I'd like to see more of. I'd like to see more disagreement. Not many people say that, right?
I don't agree with that.
Disagree about much. We don't actually disagree about much. We're very polarized, but we don't disagree. We don't disagree within our assigned group or for our set menu. Nobody deviates off their set political menu once you've been assigned left or right. You know, there's no disagreement. It's I think we have too little disagreement, not too much. And that actually, ironically, the lack of disagreement is what is polarizing society. Think about that.
Well, I want to add in first, I disagree with you. I'm disagreeing with you right here. So there's a lot of disagreement. It's happening right now. This is what it feels like. It's uncomfortable. Deal with it, everybody. Okay, Bronwyn, I am disagreeing with. Yeah, this is what conflict looks like. Everybody, you see this? We are at odds with one another in our viewpoints, and it's really difficult. And she can't handle it. I can't handle it. It's just tough. But somehow we will bridge the gap. That's the whole point. It's not supposed to be always a smooth. Yeah, isn't that weird when there's so many smooth interactions all the time, forever? It's like you're not all being actually forthcoming. It's impossible. We all come from different items and different priorities and such, but then somehow the discussions end up being way too smoothened.
I wrote an article on this a while back, like that whole phenomenon of it was also social cooling. There's a website, I think it's still up, called socialcooling.com that kind of talks about that. And that's the sort of like the general social pressure. And a lot of it's not persecution. Like most of us live in countries where we may be allowed to speak our mind. Some people don't. Some people do live in actually oppressive regimes. But the social cooling refers to the sort of self-censorship we impose upon ourselves for politeness. You know, like we don't say those things even though the emperor has literally no clothes. Nobody points it out. Everyone pretends the emperor has clothes because it's just makes society more comfortable, right? So we're all censoring ourselves. But the grand irony is then if we all pretending to agree, there might be actually no one that actually believes the consensus truth because everybody is playing a game. And like Terry Pratchett's one of my favorite authors in one of his books, Monstrous Regiment, not to give too much away. I mean, if you're interested and you haven't read the story yet and you're not interested in spoilers, go away and come back in 5 minutes. But basically it follows like a troop of soldiers who are all, at the end of the day, women pretending to be men. Every single one of them was pretending to be a boy in the story. He's obviously taken like historical, like Mulan type concepts and then just taken them to this sort of farcical, satirical conclusion. But it's so funny because they all pretending to be boys because none of them can admit that they're women, right? Because women aren't supposed to go to war. And it's just so funny because everybody was lying. There was no truth, right? So I think I find the social cooling, lack of disagreement, sort of the impoliteness of disagreement very ironic because we can all end up acting and speaking as though we believe in something that nobody actually believes in. So how ironic, the consensus is something that like theoretically maybe none of us believe in.
I've described this in the United States. Let's say California, my area, is nice in front of you, but not nice behind, in closed doors. And then whereas the East Coast is more likely to be hard hitting in front of you.
Means your face, but like.
Right, but they're actually pretty warm natured in that hard hitting, and it's not like there's a meanness behind it. probably because it's so direct and there's no time for it to build or think about other thoughts. Yeah.
They said it all, it's your face, right? So there's no surprises.
Hey, you cut me off. Hey, something. Oh, this happened. I can't believe it. I'm shocked. That's funny. Also, you mentioned, I'm pulling out all my books. You reminded me of all my books as you're mentioning.
Good,
It
good.
never happens, which means that's called a non-linear thinking mind. But free speech right there by Jacob Machangama. What do you think about free speech if we spoke about that as a moving trend in the last 10 years, the next 10 years? How is free speech going on the planet Earth?
Well, free speech goes through cycles, right? So personally, for me, I do tend to err on the sides of maximalism when it comes to free speech than not. But again, I completely understand why people would want to err on the other side. I think there's a difference between what should be legally permissible and what should be morally permissible, which is a personal choice again, right? So I tend to think that the law as a blunt instrument is probably being overused at the moment, and we have swings and roundabouts. I think that the big bellwether for me was when Europe reinstated blasphemy laws, right? This is like secular Europe, where you're not allowed to insult certain imaginary gods, which is incredible. This is like back to Dark Ages kind of times. I think that was quite a big bellwether for me, that the pendulum is swinging more towards legalizing against free speech than towards free speech. So, when we start finding people for that sort of stuff, you kind of erring on the side of perhaps protecting the right to physical violence at the expense of the right to free speech, right? So I would tend to maybe have harsher laws for actual physical violence than sort of the right to speak. Personally, from my perspective, being a woman, we know all about how sticks and stones and words will harm you much more than that and all the rest of it. But the point is, if you allow people to say their worst, you know who the bad guys are in the room, right? As soon as you start cracking down on that, you don't know. It comes back to that everybody lying all the time. And society basically is trust, right? This is where we can start getting into the whole crypto blockchain space, which is it was very well described to me by a friend of mine called Arlen Kulwick, who has been very instrumental in building the blocknet. So he described it as blockchain being the philosophy of code, which I think is much more exciting than Bitcoin being sort of the libertarian money or whatever the case is. So, but that, as much as the beautiful idea, it also comes back to the danger that I was speaking about utilitarianism and top-down functionality, which is quite ironic because a lot of what's been built and codified in this philosophy as code that you're moving into in the crypto space, but also in the AI space, is basically a codifying of certain sets of norms and values, or free speech rules, right? And codifying it in a one-size-fits-all manner, which is I love how sort of ironic human history is. Whether you're coming at this from a DeFi, crypto, anti-establishment perspective, or from an AI top-down totalitarian Orwellian sort of Eastern government perspective, they meet around the back in this idea of truth is code, philosophy is encoded, morality is encoded, and computer says no, computer says go. And they meet around the back, right? Whether that comes through consensus, all the sort of people, everyone agrees, which is exactly the opposite of what we've been speaking about, or whether that comes from a consensus of one dictator, the end result is very, very similar. I love the irony of human logic. We sort of paint ourselves into the same cul-de-sacs over and over again, which is where the whole idea of the end of history came from, right? Or I try to explain it again on my website at some point by sort of saying that the end of history conundrum that Francis Fukuyama was getting towards was this idea of, we kind of understand what's good, right? Like the French got this in the French Revolution, liberty, fraternity, equality, but you can only kind of pick two, or you have to find a space in the middle, right? Which means you're never going to have perfection of all of those things. So we kind of understand what the values and norms should be. But we're finding that balance is a struggle for us, and we end up pulling ourselves into one of those three corners and not being able to find a nice sort of dynamic equilibrium there. The human course of that evolutionary history is a constant struggle, constant dance, a constant tango of trying to find a balance between those poles. And I think that's a nice way to think about what happens. So you're asking about the trajectory of free speech. We're sort of pulling away from liberty towards more equality and fraternity again, which we do tend to do. And if you can kind of see it as that sort of three-body problem, which is kind of what we got going on there, that's where the dance is moving at the moment. And we see
I like
this.
these
We see
points.
this whether it's through the rise of sort of very totalitarian left-wing regimes, communist regimes in the sort of East, or whether it's the sort of rise of fascism in Europe, whatever, like you can kind of see the the ball swinging towards the fraternity equality side of the scale. And this is a direct response to what's happening with scarcity and degrowth. The inflationary period we're seeing at the moment, ironically, increasing money supply decreases, real stuff, which increases conflict. Same thing with degrowth. It's quite ironic that both money printing, again, the irony of human existence, like generous monetary policy and tight social policy, degrowth policy, both end up putting us into a space of conflict. And conflict can be resolved by sort of nationalism and sustaining for ourselves, like very sort of like, again, very small-minded kind of responses, which we see with fascism and hoarding and all the rest of it, or through more demands for equality for all, right, for redistribution. But both redistribution and hoarding are, again, perpetuating, again, just like I said in the beginning, with the sort of forecasts reinforces reality. Both those responses, the response of hoarding and the response of demands for redistribution and equal shares, end up actually reducing the size of the pie that we have to share, right? So unfortunately, that's the sort of base case scenario in that space, which is very similar. Again, all these layers are all connected with the sort of free speech trajectory. The same thing is happening in terms of our sort of economic response and our short-term forecasted future. Degrowth is a self-reinforcing prophecy. We're going to see more of it. We're going to see more wars, more Russia-Ukraine stories, and which is about the sort of conflict, the fighting over resources, but also more hoarding and scarcity. So yeah, that's the base case scenario that our economists, our politicians, the forecast that they've set for us. And it's sort of our choice to say whether we reinforce that by participating in the coming recession or if we refuse to do that, right? And guess what? The economy is nothing more than the sum total of our choices. And our political leaders, likewise, are nothing more than the sum choices of our endorsement. Even if we don't vote for them, there's always less of them than there are of us, right? Revolution is always an option. Come back to the French, right? It's always an option. And as long as we sort of support it, that's kind of what we get. But we have so many votes, not just at the elections. We have votes every day with our time, our attention, our money. Also something I say a lot, but hey, you invited me on your show, so I'm going to say my piece, right? Like the idea is that, like we get to choose, like whether we reinforce those ideas or not. We get to choose what we invest in, whether we invest or whether we save, or whether we refuse to participate in the economy, whether we choose to hoard for ourselves and keep our own little stash to ourselves, or whether we choose to invest in the future by building a business, by traveling and broadening our mind and getting out of our nationalist mindset. Like we get to choose what we want to see more of, right? And we get to choose by what we spend our money on, what we spend our time on, what we spend our attention on. And if we believe in a scarce future and we start hoarding for ourselves, guess what? There's less to go around for everyone else too. Money kept under the mattress doesn't create win-win sort of, like nice growing economies, which is always what growth has been about. This is why we have a higher quality of living than our grandparents did. And yes, even us, we still have a higher quality of living than our grandparents did. But there's no guarantee our grandchildren will have a higher quality of living than we do if we switch from growth and progress mindset towards hoarding and degrowth mindset. If we withhold our labor, our interest, if we choose to go into escapism, like that hedonic treadmill, instead of investing, progressing, building, doing, guess what? There's no guarantee that past performance is, going to give us future returns for what comes next. But we are beneficiaries of previous generations who chose to build and to work instead of opting out, right? Chose to invest and go to new frontiers and, did stuff. Opted out of restrictions.
It's good that they did such a thing. The hard work creates the current moment. One thing about the pendulum that came to mind when you were describing it, would you say it's fair to think of a pendulum the other way around, like actually not like swinging like this, but imagine like this, so therefore every time it gets toward close to the middle, it wants to go in one direction. We don't really do well at keeping something here. We have
I always think of it in terms of like a magnet, right? So you've got a whole lot of poles that are pulling. And, like magnets sometimes snap together, but if you can hold them in the right spot, you can like have that magic moment where the little iron ball stays floating in the middle. Like, it doesn't often happen. Quite often it snaps back into paint ourselves into a corner, but the whole idea is to have that tension always. Like you don't want people like me running the world either. There'd be chaos.
Why not, Bronwyn?
Like you want to have some like like nice people who actually believe that humans can be good people, or not total cynics like me who would take away incentives because no one can play nice with any of them.
So more like, do we? I guess so. Maybe for that, for that element. Is this related to the idea that you want to have like a more structured foundation of sorts? We can call that such individuals you're describing, and then the variety and the expansion and concepts is built on top of that. So you'd want to have this be the public base, and then this is we expand further.
Yeah, I almost think I like the idea of going back to like Tim Berners-Lee and the original sort of manifesto for the internet, which was such a beautiful idea, which is this idea that the commons, which was the internet, and interestingly, you can go into that story as to what's happening there too. The internet as we know it was based as a common space, right? I mean, like most of the tools we use are free or close to free, aren't they, right? It's a very common
Email.
space. Yeah, email, social media. Like, we get friends all across the world and we don't pay for it. We don't pay for, you used to pay, how much you used to pay for an international phone call. Now you can talk to anyone. Like you can waste time speaking to people on the other side of the world if you want. So it was built as a commons, and actually that philosophy actually did quite well. Whatever we think about the internet, it was a good commons for a long time. That point is changing, and it changed like in the middle of COVID. We can go back to that in a second too. And again, unfortunately, we're going to have to blame the libertarians for a lot of the work that they did there. But we'll get there. Unfortunately, ironically, yes. Not everything should be a market, guys. You can't price everything. But you shouldn't be pricing people. Yeah. There's limits to everything. Marginal returns to everything. That's the basic
right.
line I'm talking about. But yeah. Going back to that, we are at this very interesting tipping point at the sort of switch from the commons towards the non-commons. But going back to Tim Berners-Lee, just put a pin on that, and this whole idea of you try to build the internet on protocols rather than policies. In other words, principles rather than rules, which resonates with my sense of ethics a lot more. This idea of sort of ethics through code or philosophy through code, right? Because a protocol is like a range, it's not a target, right? These are the principles that we agree on. We agree on the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But we're not going to prescribe what that is, So there's like a bit of slack in the system, and that's a good way to think about a sustainable commons, right? It gives people enough room to make their own mistakes, their small mistakes, not just sort of consolidating those big mistakes. And we've kind of forgotten that. So now we're rebuilding, as I said, this sort of much more sort of rule by code, this much more codified version of the internet. And one of the first things we're doing there, the big switch from the so-called Web 2 to Web 3, is a commoditization of that commons. It's a repricing of everything. Again, this is coming from all directions, from your big platforms and the subscriptionification of everything, to follow on from the platformification of everything, and the other side, the sort of micro-credentialism of the perfect free market utopia that they're trying to prescribe in the sort of the crypto space, right? Which comes down to pricing, valuing, monitoring, measuring, and manipulating every single transaction. And that's again the grand irony of society, that your decentralized world is colliding with your platformed, very centralized world. What they have in common is this sort of pricing of everything, which is pricing, commodifying, and also codifying of everything, which is very unhuman. And yeah, I think that's an interesting point. So we're probably going to go pull too far in that direction before we sort of figure out that not everything should have a price. Speaking to my own choir there, but
there's like an effort I noticed that individuals make. I'm not that thing, or we're not like that. And the louder that we're not like that is, the more likely within a period of time that person is an exact, or their thing is an exact representation of that.
Yeah, I like to talk about it as like forget the sort of, it's the amoeba strip of politics, right? Like the 30 years the same place. And it's such interesting jumping off points where the different sort of schools of thought on the sort of old school Nolan Cross kind of intersect in weird places when you start to see the weird bends and things. Like how your sort of super Milton Friedman-esque libertarians and your total lefty commies all agree on universal basic income, which is a very totalitarian idea, right? And also, never mind the all sort of left and right sort of bend and kink there. But there's various issues where you can see the different tribes intersect in very interesting ways.
I remember that actually. Milton Friedman was mentioned quite a bit in this one. You reminded me of they did polls where they checked with Republican individuals and Democratic individuals, and one of the largest points of similarity between them was that they both agreed that there was financial corruption in the government, something like that. That was like a point of, they could all come together on that.
Agreement. A point of agreement is a good thing, right? Also a point of disagreement with your own tribe, so that's all good, right?
You could go around with a sign that says, there's financial corruption in the government, and everybody would be like, we're with this.
Yeah,
we're with this.
we can get behind this.
We all support it. That's a funny one. Now, one thing I was wondering is, when you speak on, are you more reporting the trends as they're happening? Are you consulting and advising individuals on what is to be? Where does your area of expertise that you pass on to others most lay in? What do you bring to them?
Well, what we do at the moment at my consultancy Flex Trends, we're kind of at the intersection of the present and the future. So we kind of do 5 minutes, 5 months, or 5 years ahead. That's what we talk about. So sort of 5 minutes ahead, we kind of talking about sort of short-term trends, which is already things that have already happened, and we sort of conveying that information to people. You might not be aware that in this industry or in this part of the world, this is happening, and it could be interesting to your business, right? So that's a sort of 5 minutes sort of like much more trend orientated, quite backwards looking, but it's still new to the people that we sort of bring these ideas to. 5 months and 5 years ahead. Well, the 5 months is kind of looking at, so what does that mean going forward, right? But like still like, well, how's this going to affect you in your next quarter of your business, the next sort of planning cycle? If those things that we have mentioned that are happening, if they coincide or if they interconnect in your industry, how is that going to affect you? And because that's still quite short-term planning, we're able to sort of make quite confident choices, like this is going to happen. I mean, if it's happening everywhere else in the world, it's going to happen here. So you take an example of something like an Airbnb. So it starts in America, and now it's in Australia, and it's in England, and you can say to South Africans, it's coming here, guys. Like, either they're going to do it or you're going to do it. People will be sharing their homes using an app. You can quite confidently make that call. It's not exactly rocket science. There's no crystal balls involved in the 5 months ahead. It's just think through the logic here, follow the incentive. This is like it's already in play. The 5 years ahead is where we do a bit of futures work, looking at the forecasting. So saying, how do we deviate off those trend lines? How do we create the future that we want? And that's much more of a sort of a workshopping type process. It's classic futures. This is, as I said, it's a real job. You can go to school and you can study. It's a pre-strategy function. Hopefully, if you are smart, you will do a sort of foresight exercise before you go and commit to spending your millions of dollars with your McKinseys or your PwCs to actually execute your strategy. Hopefully, you've actually thought about where you want to be going first and why, which is the whole point of the sort of futures exercise. And that's what people bring in. Futurists like ourselves, who are professional outsiders, not insiders. We don't do consulting on actual execution projects because that would effectively turn us into people that are industry specific, not actually, we wouldn't be useful. We're only useful because we know a little bit about everything. We're able to sort of connect those dots. So how did I describe it today, earlier to someone else? As sort of like, everyone can see the stars, but we can kind of point out what's the scorpion or what's the ram, like that's our sort of job. But we have to be able to look out there and see what's going on. And we have to be outsiders, professional outsiders, in order to be useful. So engagements are always short term. That's the difference between us and a real consultancy. The strategy piece, pre-strategy, that's where we fit in.
Right. You're in South Africa. How would you describe the current trajectory of the economy there, and is it connected with any other countries or regions of the world, like directly, where they both are in concert with one another?
We all in concert with each other. We do have a globalized financial system, which is why it's so fragile, right? So we maximize the efficiency. We don't have super much resilience in terms of our sort of financial system, which is why the things like your cryptocurrencies are probably a good thing, because they add a little bit of resistance to the system, right? It's a slightly different system. It adds, again, choice. Choice slows us down in some ways, and it creates its own risks, but it creates conflict, which is probably a good thing. We don't have necessarily much conflict in our financial system. That's probably quite a controversial statement, but basically, ironically, we all kind of at the mercy of our global petrodollar economy, right? Like, unfortunately, when like Joe Biden does helicopter money drops for people in America, South Africans get poorer because that money finds its way into the global system. You know, like inflation is regressive at a global scale, not just at a domestic scale. And quite ironically, domestically progressive policy is internationally very regressive. Because, you know, currencies are unfairly weighted, right? Like they are weaker and stronger currencies. Like we can't just give everyone in South Africa the same amount of money that America did to compete, which means that we have less coins at the table, less chips on the poker wheel. And that money is global. That money doesn't stay within the border where it was printed, right? But if we do that, then we'll have an inflationary sort of crisis, which happens when you overshoot your belief quotient. So like money is propped up by two things, by faith and by force. Like either by men with guns or, you know, countries with armies that can say, yes, you will believe in the value of my currency, or I will make you believe in it. Same way your tax man has to be sort of back it up by force, right? Like you will believe in my currency and you will pay me some of it every month, or you will go to jail. It's backed up by force or by faith. And most currencies have a combination of both. And that's the expectation that it has value. Again, expectations make reality. Like the likes of your cryptocurrencies are backed entirely by faith at this point. They will become backed by force as those sort of those network states become realities, you know, and as governments start to adopt those cryptocurrencies as national tender, they will have some force backing them too. But essentially, you've got those two levers, and some countries have more of those levers than others, right? And if you have more of them, you have an outsized advantage at the table. And if you use that power, as people want to do, right? You know, the strong take what they will, the weak suffer what they must. That's kind of where we are at the moment. So we're at the mercy of global forces, and we're also at the mercy of a lot of our own goals in South Africa. We haven't exactly made our smartest choices in investing in our own faith and our own currency over the last sort of 200 years. We made a lot of mistakes. So we can't only blame international forces, but it is all interconnected. And certainly the rest of the rich world getting richer does directly make developing nations poorer. There's a very interesting book by a South African called Malcolm Ray, who wrote The Tyranny of Growth, which I'm trying to get all Americans to read, because I think it's an interesting story from an African perspective. He's much more left-wing than I am, but I totally respect what he's done there. We should read books that we disagree with, and people we disagree with, because you might learn something.
100% on that.
I think I said a lot without saying really anything, but you can pick up on any of that.
Maybe to some, but not to myself. And you just actually reminded me of something key. No, you said a lot. In my world, you're saying a lot. But today, I spoke with someone who is Armenian, actually, an older person who's also born in Iran, same as me. And he talked about how something like what you just said for South Africa, Armenians would think about all the other countries and follow all the history and watch them, except they don't really concern with themselves and don't invest. Kind of like what you just said for South Africa. And I asked him this, but he didn't really have, he kind of went to a different topic. But what do you think causes a person or a country or a group to not invest in themselves and invest in others first? Is it the dynamics? What could cause such a thing?
Well, it's the incentive, right? So it's either fear or greed. Like when it comes to money, there's kind of two things. And in terms of like developing markets, if you have capital, both of those levers and those incentives are very, very powerful. So I can speak of myself. I'm probably like a privileged upper middle class South African, which means I'm a huge minority, which that's the wrong way to put it. I'm a tiny minority in my country, and which means I'm lucky. I have capital, that I have disposable income, which I can be fearful of, and I can be like, oh, our country is going to go to the dogs. The rand's going to go even further than the pound compared to the dollar. We must protect. We must hedge our bets. We must take our money outside of our dangerous little market and put it somewhere else. And if everybody that is privileged in my position makes that same choice, we all take our money out of our country, use our capital exchange allowance, take it away, hide it, save it for ourselves, hoard it. All we end up doing is taking an extra bit of lifeblood out of the economy that could have been used to actually kickstart the economy. So the economy is the sum total of all of our choices. And if we all make fearful choices, we actually increase the odds of what we fear happening, which means that if you are going to take your money offshore and put it in an offshore tax haven, you should be prepared to follow your money there pretty soon, because if people like you are making that choice, so are other people, which means that likely our actions do, our beliefs, our forecasts do become self-fulfilling prophecies. So, we have to understand that if we act out of fear, chances are everybody else is too, and we are going for a declining economy at an accelerating rate. It's the thing with brain drains, this thing with capital outflows, all the rest of it. And of course, as soon as there are capital outflows, governments also respond to incentives. They'll crack down on capital outflows, which means the richer people will run away, literally taking everything with them. This is how sort of negative cycles happen, right? So that's the one thing that happens with developing markets, that acting out of fear makes things worse, not just for everyone else, but for yourself too, ironically. The other thing is the greed incentive, right? So if you feel like your economy isn't doing so well compared to someone else's, you want to arbitrage against that. You want to invest in Bitcoin because Bitcoin is more exciting than your currency, or you want to invest in the dollar because the dollar's doing well. And what you're doing then, although you're responding out of greed, not out of fear, because now you're a young person and you think you're very clever, you're going to hit on this trade, you're still betting against your country on a very literal sense. You're betting against your own economy. You're betting other things will work out better than you are. Again, your expectations do become a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you're thinking that way, you're not a lone genius here. Like, other people are kind of thinking along those lines too. And if everybody sort of tries to do that, of course, again, there's more capital outflows, and the chances of your own economy actually outperforming your little sneaky, like, get-rich-quick asset become less over time. So the world is a very, very unfair place. So you've got the fear and greed of domestic populations competing, or not competing, adding to the very unfairness of the global casino game. Because it's not a fair game. Like, Monopoly is a fun game to play as a game. It's not a fun game to play when some people have different rules to others. Like, in Monopoly, some people still end up winning anyway. But what's happening with the global economy is that certain countries, or certain sort of nations, certain currencies, have extra chips to start with. You're not starting from the same game. Or you can imagine it like a soccer match, but like the one team is only allowed to, it has to play with their ankles tied together, right? But the other team doesn't. And like, it's so fair. So it's not the way it works. So you have an unfair system that incentivizes the weak to act against their own interests, which is hugely unfair. I think that sort of, like, awareness of what's happening is the first step in the conversation. And I think that one of our big problems when it comes to having these conversations is that money is spoken about as a national issue, although it has global spillover. And especially if you are in your politics, if you lean right or left, whatever your sort of case may be, think about it not just on a national level, think of it but in an international level, right? So, policies that might seem to benefit your tribe or your group within your country would have exactly the opposite effect on your tribe in another country. So this whole idea of sort of empathy is, I think, quite interesting in politics. And maybe that will challenge some people to think beyond the set menu of their sort of color printouts, what do we have in our country? We've got blue, red, and yellow, and you've got sort of blue and red, right? Think beyond the set menu. Think about what that does to the other menus, Anyway. That's basically the simplest way I could describe why emerging economies keep sucking. Vicious cycles.
This is a great point. It's like, I don't know why I'm visualizing like a bowl, and then there's a huge bowl, and then there's other bowls, and then you pour water in this bowl, or you take it out, and it affects the other bowls. It's not the best analogy, but
yeah, money doesn't stay there, right? It gives an advantage to some. I mean, like trickle down economics gets a bad rap, but in terms of inflation, in terms of money supply, changes to money supply, whether it's a contraction or an expansion, it has different effects at different points of the economy. The sort of first drink out of the tap gets a lot more out of it than the people further down the food chain, right? So it's kind of the opposite of trickle down, right? It's trickle up that we see a lot of.
That's a great one. The first drink, right, or first mover in the market gets the real.
So it's like, it's an example we complain about all the time. And again, people act in their own incentives. So this is why things self-perpetuate. So again, like if the dollar monetary supply increases, and of course, like what happens when there is like a monetary supply increase, it tends to be that the richest people end up collecting the most outsized share, because poorer people, even if everybody gets given the same amount, even if, say, hypothetically you increase your money supply and you distribute it entirely equally on a per person, per capita basis, still more of that money is going to accumulate in the hands of the rich because the poor will spend it out of necessity, right? The rich will be able to invest it. And largely the poor will end up buying things from the rich who have added a markup to it anyway. So anyway, your capital tends to accumulate in pools. That's even at a domestic level. So even assuming that doesn't happen, that everybody still manages to save the same proportion and everybody gets a little bit richer. In fact, it's quite progressive and you gave more to the poor people and less to the rich people. That money looks for opportunities to grow, right? And that money is not going to stay in your domestic market. If you see that there is cheap property going in South Africa, you're going to take some of that money and you're going to use it to buy up real assets in other marketplaces, right? Because money is only potential wealth until it is actualized by being converted into actual scarce assets, right? Like it's all potential. Tell that to everyone invested in crypto too. It's still in the casino until you cash it out, you know? Like, you know, you have to actually cash it out in order to actualize that potential energy. That potential energy is actualized by buying up scarce resources in weaker markets. And what that does is it drives up the prices for the domestic market. So rents in my country will go up when your wealth goes up, right? That's not fair, but that happens, right? Property prices will go up, enriching the landlord. If you're a sort of leftist, sort of liberal, maybe you need to kind of think about that, right? That's, you know, when the poor in your country, who are still much richer than the poor in other countries, get a little bit richer, the poor in other countries get even more poor in an absolute and relative terms, which is a very uncomfortable sort of sermon to have. Again, not everyone likes these sorts of conversations, but I think it's an abject reality, right? So like rents go up, real goods prices of things like energy and food go up. Anything that's sort of got global context, right? So more money chasing the same amount of goods. It's not actually more money for everyone, right? It's still the same amount of stuff. But anyway, those are the sort of incentives we see. And of course, the perverse incentives are for domestic opportunities too, because people in my country don't have to take external money to sell their property or anything else, but they will, because of course they want to do better for themselves, right? So by making ourselves richer as individuals, by taking that sort of poisoned chalice, because, you know, we only live for so long, I also want to retire, so I will take the higher price, even though I know that actually, if everybody else thinks the same way, I'm only impoverishing myself too, because overall my entire country's economy is not going to strengthen relative to the rest of the world, which is, again, just this whole sum total of the world is a sum total of all of our choices, and we have to decide what we want more of.
Nobody ever mentions this part of the after effects, where what happens in some nations that are more substantial affects other ones. That's never added into the discussion.
No, because policy is discussed at a national level. Like other countries don't have votes in your country. You know, like that's not the your domestic voters will objectively be better off from that policy. That's the other thing that like we have to admit as emerging market economies or as the weak. We have to understand that bad behavior in other nations actually does benefit your citizens.
It's the next level that I get the feeling I'm going to
You
be...
just can't act against incentives. Like the incentive is there. Everybody's going to act in the way they act. And the outcome is greater inequality, although the policy was designed to reduce inequality. That's incentives trump the intention every time.
You made me think of one thing when you describe incentives and also attention towards something. Like if you take your money and you put it in a far-off island. Same thing with like if there's a relationship and a person's thinking about other person at times, or if someone has money but they leave some money in their homeland country. These kinds of things where, or if someone's working on a project but actually they take breaks to look at these, some sort of YouTube video or something. Wherever your deviation goes to, it's not just you, other people are doing it too, and that is becoming a market of its own, but the average individual will think, no, I'm just there's no sneaky, you know? It's like there's no hidden element. Is there something to that concept?
Yeah, I think so, but I think that you can't really judge people for acting in their own interests either. We have to set up systems that where acting in your own interest is for everyone else's interest, and that's the beauty of free markets, which comes back to the book you were showing earlier, right? It's really the only free lunch we get in this world is when everybody acts in their own interest to the benefit of everyone else. And that can happen. And in fact, it does happen if people are left to freely sort of trade among themselves. I'm not just talking about sort of economic trade, also sort of trade of ideas, where it breaks down, where that sort of win-win, that like only free lunch we get in the marketplace, which comes from an exchange of utility, because I don't like apples and you don't like pears, and you've got pears and I've got apples, and we get to swap them and we're both happy. That's one of the only ways we can actually do that. And that's through sort of free trade, not through sort of prescriptive sort of policy. But the free trade breaks down because we have monopolies everywhere. So I like to say it's not money that's the root of all evil, it's monopoly that's the root of all evil. So whether that's a monopoly on money at a global scale, whether that's a monopoly on natural resources, and that includes land and property, by the way. You know, like this is where unfairness comes from. This is where win-lose equations come from. This is why we have class issues, right? It's because there's the people that own property that have virtuous circles working in their favor. They can take international money and retire young, whereas you got the renters who get poorer every time that person acts in their own interest. It's monopolies that make unfairness in this world. So I like to think about if we want to change the incentives, we have to attack monopolies ruthlessly.
That thing you just mentioned reminded me of Rob Henderson. He posts on Twitter.
And
he talks about luxury books.
We trade book recommendations every now and again.
That's cool. This concept of luxury beliefs and how they're able, people up there are able to make certain statements that are fine from them, but actually are not beneficial to those who don't have what they have. So it's like a maintenance kind of belief. Maintains the space between them. Interesting.
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept. The luxury beliefs, luxury goods, all the rest of it, right? But I think it's a slightly different point, but it does speak to human nature. That's just going to happen anyway, right? We are status-seeking mammals. And even if you take away all the money points, we'll still find a way to score and rate each other, right? Like, this is what we do.
Is it true?
This is part of our evolutionary grift again, right? You know, the idea of conflict. That's what it comes down to, right? What is it? Oscar Wilde who said that like everything's about sex except sex, which is about power. I mean, that kind of speaks to that point, right? We want to be top of the crowd.
We're up here. That's true. There's some wisdom in that.
But that's both a virtue and a vice of humanity. The conflict idea. To say it's like part of that dynamic tension.
That's a valid point. One thing I want to check. Two other things. One of them is what would you say are some of your what would be 3 words you would use to describe your personality that you identify with, that is like a moving forward positive force for yourself? Like 3 words that you identify with.
I do tend to describe myself as being on the chaotic evil spectrum. I don't know if that helps, but
Chaotic evil.
yeah.
Okay. So chaotic evil. So okay, evil.
Bad guys often get a rap, you know, like you're only bad by perspective. It's like you're just not bad. I'm just drawn that way, right? You know, like Jessica Rabbit said. So I don't know. That's only 2 words, but I don't do much describing of myself. I'll let you project what you think on me. I don't even.
I would say chaotic.
I would use like the AI facial recognition things. Even my own phone thinks I'm 3 different people.
Those 3 people are
yeah,
chaotic.
you know, like it shows your phone shows like who's this, who's in this picture. I'm 3 people there. Some like the phone thinks I'm
combination of sorts. I'll say chaotic, evil, and I'm going to throw in non-linear, but that's kind of similar to chaotic. It has a little bit of a difference. Multifaceted, because not many people can link concepts so clearly. They just can't. I don't think they can. So
it happens if you read too much from too young. Don't let girls read. Hey.
Oh, and that was going to be my other. In the category of books, have there been any books that have had a large impact on you or your thoughts for a long time, or authors that come to mind where it's like without reading their work, you would not have gone in the direction you are?
Well, Terry Pratchett lives rent-free in my brain. I mean, like, I think he's the greatest philosopher of our age. And he's entertaining too. He's funny also. But read him for the philosophy. There's a lot of books there. But like he just manages to boil philosophy down to what it really is. Like, don't treat people like things. Evil is treating people like things. This is a very simple concept, right? You know, like he's just there's not much that he hasn't got a wise commentary on. So yeah, he does. I'm at least sort of like 30% Pratchett inside my brain, like just there background.
That's one of the three people.
It's definitely shaped a lot of my thinking. More recently, I read Clive James's Cultural Amnesia. So he's an Australian writer, but that is a fascinating book of around about, I think it's about 200 profiles of various different historical figures in the lead up to and the aftermath of the Second World War. So that book it nailed a lot of things that I think he thinks in quite a similar way to I do, like have quite a broad perspective and is able to sort of bring it home. It's an unusual book, not the sort of book that you'd expect to read. Also quite a thick, chunky thing, but I think I did enjoy his way of thinking quite a lot. And then Eric Hoffer's True Believer. I mean, like that's just essential reading for small people. And Will and Ariel Durant's The Lessons of History, the short, skinny book, just sort of sums a lot of this sort of stuff up. Again, I can't necessarily say that those books were books that changed the way I thought about the world, but they were books that came to similar conclusions that I have after having read very widely for a very long time, both fiction, nonfiction, science fiction, history, politics, economics, the whole lot, I think that people that do read widely, you can't help but sort of start to connect the dots, that like fiction picks up on human truths that no textbook can ever get to. And I do enjoy reading authors who have read widely, because that's how you come to sort of zone in on probably some of these sort of universal truths that are always there, kind of like maths, like what goes up comes down. The same things with incentives and people, right? Like if you show a human an apple and tell it not to eat it, you get us. Like that's the way it is. And like that's also why I'm a big fan of Pratchett again, because if you read his books when you're a kid, you enjoy the story. If you read them as an adult, you realize how many Easter eggs he packed in there because he was so widely read himself. And I think that's how I appreciate people who've done that work. And it's validating a little bit to feel that people that have read widely do tend to converge on certain things. That's not to say that you should agree with anyone entirely. I don't believe in being a fan of anyone at all. Be a fan of work, a fan of an idea, but certainly don't be a fan of a person, because the last thing we need is everyone to think the same way.
That's true. And also negates some of your own personhood. Now you're
exactly.
Latched on. It's interesting. I like that message.
Well, who was it? Luke Burgess, the one who wrote Wanting. He picked up on some of René Girard's and then simplified them for the masses. Like he took the very complicated ideas and sort of consolidated them into sort of bite-sized chunks and sort of spoon-fed them to people. But he had this idea of having a black bookshelf, which is a bookshelf of books with authors who you disagree with, who you force yourself to read. People that I
like the category.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Know thy enemy, and then maybe you'll become friends.
You probably have more similarities with the opposing view than with someone you're completely neutral with.
Yeah, you got to challenge yourself. Don't drink your own Kool-Aid, like ever. And really question people who like what you say on social media. Don't give people what they want. As soon as you start getting fans, as much as you shouldn't be a fan, as soon as you start getting fans, if you have a little bit of fame, and people start saying, do the thing, say the thing, poke the bear, don't do it. Resist the temptation. This is not great advice if you want to grow a podcast. Don't listen to me.
No, I like that philosophy.
Give the people what they want, but don't drink your own Kool-Aid, for real.
I like the counter force you're bringing on that one, because that's more my style too. I'm sort of a counter element there. Dang. Bronwyn, I added this. I might do this in future time too, but it's a nice thing that people normally do. Where can people find your material if they want to see any work of yours or such? Where is your resources?
Well, I'm quite easy to find on Twitter. I'm at Bronwyn Williams. Otherwise, my website is bronwynwilliams.com, and my business is flextrends.com. You can find me there and abouts.
That is super cool. Bronwyn, I would like to thank you for having joined on this episode. bringing a wonderful discussion that speaks in the way that I speak, which is of various concepts linking together. That's the way my mind works, and bringing us a variety of knowledge on things that connected with books I've even talked about before, all in one.
Thank you so much.
You know it, and we are out.